Welcome to the Launch SSAT Reading Tips video on the specific steps that you should be taking while you're working through each of the passages in the reading section of the SSAT. And this video will also cover some general tips that you should keep in the back of your head while you're working through those passages. So the first step is to read each passage very carefully and within 2 minutes. Make sure that you actively engage with the text and that the information that the text is presenting you with is actively going through your mind and that you're actively absorbing it. If you're working on a practice test on paper, then feel free to underline any important points that you may come across. And the second step is to cover up the answers. This step is absolutely crucial. This ensures that the questions that are being presented on the test are not confusing you and they're not causing you to doubt yourself, because a lot of these questions are designed to lead you astray. You should only read the answers if it is absolutely mandatory. One example of these kinds of questions is the question, which of the following questions is directly answered by the passage? So the steps are, you should read the question, you should think of an answer, and then you should go back to the text and find evidence to support whatever thought that you had inside of your head. Then you should go back, actually read the answer choices, and then select an answer choice that is closest to the answer that you have thought of and now have evidence for. So some general tips for the reading section: you should find answers that are MTA, and that stands for mentioned in the passage, true, and answers the question effectively. You should also be wary of answers that are too broad, too narrow, or incorrect. Sometimes there will be questions in which it's really difficult for you to narrow down the answers to the correct choice. But if you can even eliminate one answer, you should just keep eliminating answers and just guess. However, if the question is such that you can't even think of an answer within your head to answer the question, you should go back to the text and find evidence that supports an answer for the question. And if you still can't find an answer, look at the answers and eliminate one. And then go back to the text and find evidence that supports at least one of the answers that is presented. And keep in mind that this might be in a different place in the passage than where you had looked previously. And last but not least, if you have absolutely zero clue what the answer is, skip the question. This is essential because the SSAT will dock points off of your score if you get an answer incorrect. But they won't dock answers off of your score if you just skip it. So in order to get the best score possible, just skip a question if you absolutely have no idea what the answer could possibly be and you've done all the steps that were mentioned previously. Alright, so now let's move on to our first passage. So this passage is a little bit long, so make sure that you also read this bottom blurb before we get to the questions. So take a few minutes, read this passage, and then we'll move on to the questions. Let's take a look at the first question. As a result of bad weather, okay, so I can see that this is a detail question. So it's asking me to go back into the text and to look for a specific detail that supports my answer. So I remember reading that as a result of bad weather, the airport seemed to be pretty crowded, a little chaotic, and that flights were late. Okay, now let's go back to the passage, and it says, because of the holiday and winter weather delays, the airport was crowded and many flights were canceled or late. Okay, great. So we have the proof that the airport was crowded and many flights were canceled or late. Now let's go back, armed with this information, and answer the questions. A, Mrs. Miller's son had not arrived home. Okay, Mrs. Miller was not even brought up yet in this point in the passage, so A is not the answer. B, flights were late or canceled, so that's exactly what we found in the passage. So yes, it was mentioned in the passage. C, the flight attendant was rude to Mrs. Miller. We hadn't even boarded the plane at this point, so this is not a possible answer. Mrs. Miller was escorted onto the plane. Well, she was also not brought up yet in this passage, and the passengers were in a hurry. So while this may be true, it wasn't explicitly mentioned like B was. So let's go with B for this answer. Now looking at the second question, this is an inferential question. It's asking you to infer something from the text without reading about it explicitly. So the reader can infer the plane took off. Okay, so if we think about it, the plane took off around 1 p.m. but there might have been a delay because of Mrs. Miller's whole situation. So let's go back to the passage and find some information that might support our theory. So it says, boarding for my flight began at 1:15, and then it says that the pilot announced on the public address system, okay folks, we're cleared for departure at 1:35. It seems like this is sometime in the afternoon, and even if there was a delay, it didn't seem like it took an extraordinary amount of time, so they probably took off around 1:35 or 2, so basically sometime in the early afternoon. Okay, now let's go back. Number 2, the reader can infer the plane took off half an hour late. Okay, that wasn't mentioned in the text. B, in the morning. That's just incorrect because we're talking about the afternoon. C, in the early afternoon. That's pretty specific, and that's what we had thought of initially. D, at some unknown time. Well, that's also true, but that's kind of broad. And E, on time. I don't believe that they took off on time because of Mrs. Miller's situation, so let's go with C as our final answer. 3. The description of Mrs. Miller suggests that she. So this requires that we go back to the passage, look for details of Mrs. Miller's description, and then we infer something from it. So let's go back, and I feel like it mentions something about her seeming pretty put together. Okay, so it says she was an older woman with well-cut white hair. Her face, although lined, was carefully but not overly made up. She wore a stylish suit and small earrings. Okay, so she seems like she can take care of herself, that she's pretty put together. So let's look at the answer choices. A, loves her son and grandson. Okay, I do not get any hint of that from the description of her appearance. B, has a sense of humor. Once again, this is not mentioned in the text, and it's not something we can infer from her description. C, is a very wealthy woman. Okay, maybe. Let's keep looking. D, cares about her appearance. Okay, that's for sure. E, cannot take care of herself. Okay, that's not true. She's very well put together. Can we specifically say that she's a very wealthy woman? I don't think you have to be very wealthy in order to make yourself look presentable. The most accurate answer is D, cares about her appearance. D is more strongly supported by the passage than C, which is more specific, and we don't find any specific details that point to the idea that she's wealthy. Number 4, the airline people asked Mrs. Miller to leave the plane because, well, let's think of an idea for this answer. It seems as if the airport was really crowded, and as we know from before, the flights were late or canceled, so they probably want to take off on time. Okay, so now let's go back to the passage and find any details that might support this idea. It says, ma'am, I'm sorry. We need to have you deplane. I'm sure the airport personnel will be able to help you find your son. Then she guided Mrs. Miller to the exit. So it seems as if they wanted her to deplane so that other people at the airport could help her, and it was probably because they wanted to take off around 1:35 when they were supposed to take off. So let's go back here. It said A, they want to help her find her son. No, they kind of gave that task to other people at the airport. B, they want to take off as soon as possible. Okay, that sounds pretty similar to what we were thinking about earlier. C, other passengers were in a hurry. That might be true, but it seems as if B is more supported by the passage than C is. D, she didn't know her son's telephone number. Well, when they mentioned her telephone number, it was more of something that the author was hypothesizing about. So this is likely not true. E, she was confused. I don't think that they made her deplane because she was confused. I think they made her deplane because she needed to find her son, and the best way to do so was to return to the airport. Okay, great. B is the right answer. 5. Which of the following words describes the author of this passage? If we go back to this section here, we see that the author was clearly very concerned about Mrs. Miller and really care for her, even though the author did not know Mrs. Miller. If I had to come up with a couple of words to describe the author, I would say caring, probably kind of sensitive, thoughtful. So let's go back here. A, observant. Yes, the author was definitely very observant of Mrs. Miller's situation. B, compassionate. C, sensitive. So these are definitely all words that describe the author, and luckily if we look at E, there is an option to choose all 3 of these. So great, let's go back through the answers. So first answer would be B, then C, then D, and then B, then E. Perfect. So now let's move on to the second passage. Take some time, pause the video, and read through the passage. So now let's take a look at the first question. This passage was most probably written. After reading the passage, I feel like it uses a lot of words that we might not use in today's language, and there are some customs that aren't necessarily ones that we might have today, such as calling a married woman by her husband's entire name. If we go back to the passage, it says Sister Mrs. Joe Gargery. In today's society, most people just take the Mrs. and they take the last name of their husband. They don't necessarily take their first name. So this makes me believe that this was probably something that was written around the 1800s, 1700s. Yeah, so now let's take a look at the answers. Last year, about 5 years ago, less than 25 years ago, I think these are all time spans that aren't necessarily close to the 1800s, what we had originally had in mind. D, more than 100 years ago. Yeah, that sounds about right. And E, about 2,000 years ago. That seems a little too broad. And so I'm going to go with D, more than 100 years ago. That seems the most plausible. And these other answers, A, B, and C, are a little bit too recent. So this is definitely an example of an inferential question in which it asks you to think of an answer that isn't explicitly presented by the text. Second question. In the passage, the word fancies means, okay, this is definitely a vocabulary question, so we should go back and try to find some context. So it says, as I never saw my father or my mother and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. Okay, my first ideas of what they were like, so it seems like this author has never met his father or his mother, and he's never seen what they've looked like. So he is trying to get an idea of what they probably looked like from their tombstones. So let's go through the answers. Grown-up thoughts, elaborate lettering, hopes and dreams, imagined ideas, and writing on tombstones. So actually, D fits perfectly with what we were thinking about. So let's go ahead and let's choose D. Okay, now the third question. It says, Pip never saw any pictures of his birth parents because. So if we think about something inside of our heads, it seems like they probably died before photography was invented or cameras were around. So let's go back to the passage and find some information that supports our theory. So it says, for their days were long before the days of photographs. And then it says that my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. So now let's look to the answer choices. A, they died before cameras are invented. Okay, that's definitely what we were thinking of. B, he was adopted. Okay, that's not explicitly mentioned in the text. Remember, M-T-A. C, his sister prevented him from seeing their photographs. That's also not mentioned. D, he ran away from home. Also not mentioned. E, they never wanted him to see any photographs of him. This is also not mentioned, and it's not necessarily something that you can even infer from the details that are presented in the text. So let's go with A. Going to the fourth question, Pip's sister's name is. Okay, this is definitely a detail question. So I believe it was Mrs. Joe Gargery. Let's go back and double check. I give Perup as my father's family name, sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. Okay, it's Mrs. Joe Gargery. Let's keep that in our heads. A, Mrs. Pip, nope. B, Mrs. Perup, nope. C, Mrs. Stout, nope. D, Mrs. Gargery, yes. And E, Mrs. Phillip. Okay, so let's go with D, Mrs. Gargery. 15. Pip's sister's husband works as a blank. Okay, this is also a detail question. I believe he was a blacksmith. Let's go back and double check. Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. So her husband works as a blacksmith. And there we have it. A, blacksmith. And so if you look at the other options, stonecutter, photographer, barber, and grave digger, these were not explicitly mentioned in the text like A was. So the answers are D, D, A, D, and A.